Clay West never had much use for rules that made no sense. Not out of rebellion, not from ignorance, but because he believed a man's land should speak for itself. He had earned every inch of his 20-acre ranch, carved it out of sweat and quiet sacrifice. It wasn't some picturesque fantasy of wooden rocking chairs and glossy horses trotting in slow motion. His land was practical, purpose-built, and worked hard every day just like him. Nestled along the far edge of Cedar Heights, a sprawling residential development filled with manicured hedges and quarterly newsletters, Clay's property was a stubborn, enduring reminder of what came before. His family had lived on that ridge long before Cedar Heights was ever zoned or paved. His father raised cattle there, and before him, his grandfather bred quarter horses. Clay himself transitioned the land into a working ranch and horse therapy school. A modest, honorable operation, not built for tourists but for kids who needed structure, veterans looking for silence, and horses needing something to do. Most people left him alone, and he offered them the same courtesy. He wasn't neighborly in the coffee and cake sense, but he was dependable. Folks knew Clay would fix your gate if a storm took it, pull your truck out of a ditch if you slid in the snow, or put down a stray coyote without turning it into a town meeting. He was a man you could count on, but only if you understood what lines not to cross. Cedar Heights never quite figured that out. The developers had stretched the master plan just enough to wrap around Clay's eastern field, making his driveway technically open to shared access, though legally still private. That small detail would have remained just that, small, if not for the gradual creep of authority that began with mild suggestions and ended with brightly colored violation tags. The incident started on a Thursday, just before noon, when Clay returned from hauling feed. The dust hadn't yet settled from his tires when he saw it. A large, fluorescent orange sticker plastered across the hood of his 2022 Silverado, right above the emblem, bold and unmistakable. The words "community violation" were printed in all caps, followed by a handwritten note that read, "Truck does not comply with community aesthetic. Must be removed or relocated within 48 hours. Failure to comply may result in fines or towing." The paper itself was thick, weather-sealed, and glued on with something that clearly wasn't meant to come off without a fight. Clay stood there for a moment, staring at the absurdity. His truck was clean, recently waxed, parked on gravel at the far end of his own property, angled neatly beside the feed shed. There was no trash, no oil spill, no engine parts in sight. It wasn't blocking anything. There was no music playing, no sign of activity besides a pair of hay bales in the bed and a coffee thermos in the cup holder. It was a truck doing what it was meant to do, and somehow that had become a violation. He didn't get angry, not in the way that showed. Clay didn't throw things or curse or storm off. Instead, he reached for his phone, took photos from every angle, zoomed in on the sticker, the placement, the surroundings. Then he walked the full boundary of his property, making note of where the public road ended and his legal easement began. He found a small green surveyor's flag behind a cedar post, recently placed, still bright with no weather fading. Someone had been measuring, likely without his knowledge or consent. He took a photo of that, too. That evening, after feeding the horses and finishing his notes for the therapy session scheduled that weekend, Clay sat down at his old wooden desk, pulled out the property deed, and cross-checked the zoning maps available through the county. Website, everything aligned with his memory. The driveway remained under his parcel. The adjacent access road was shared only for emergencies, and no jurisdiction had ever been formally transferred. But someone clearly wanted to test that. He printed everything he needed, 4 copies of each document, and placed them in a labeled folder. Then he wrote a single email to his attorney, Alicia Monroe, and scheduled a call. By the following morning, things had already escalated. The sticker was still there, now partially curled from the sun, but still firmly adhered. What hadn't been there yesterday was the bright yellow tow notice hanging from his gate post. No official city logo, just a laminated sheet with the heading final warning, and a date scribbled underneath. He reviewed the language. It was vague, poorly formatted, and referenced enforcement statutes that didn't exist in their state's code. Whoever had authored it either didn't know the law or was banking on the assumption that he didn't. Clay smiled at that, not with amusement but with an edge of quiet certainty. That was their first mistake. The second came later that same day, when he stopped by the small glass-doored office in the community plaza labeled Neighborhood Administrative Center. Inside, 3 women in matching polo shirts sat behind desks, clicking through spreadsheets and chatting softly. The middle-aged brunette at the center desk wore a name tag that read, Melissa, Senior Liaison. She didn't look up when he entered. "Can I help you?" she asked in that overly sweet, condescending tone used on difficult customers or confused seniors. Clay stepped forward, dropped the laminated tow notice and the violation sticker, now cleanly peeled off, on her desk, and laid his folder beside them. "Yes," he said plainly. "You can explain who authorized this." Melissa blinked, clearly caught off guard. She read the sticker, glanced at the notice, then at Clay's weather-worn but neatly kept face. She straightened a little, her fingers brushing her keyboard. "That's standard compliance. We received a report." "From whom?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose that." "You don't need to. I already know. Karen Stratton," he said, folding his arms. "Her name's on the informal complaint filed last year when I wouldn't let her grandchildren run through my barn." Melissa's lips tightened. "That aside," Clay continued, "this here," he tapped the notice, "is illegal. You've got no jurisdiction on private land. My driveway is not shared access. It's easement protected. I've got property records, zoning confirmation, and photographs. If that tow truck touches my vehicle, I will sue for trespass and unlawful interference." Melissa opened her mouth, then thought better of it. Clay let the silence stretch. "I'll expect a written apology by Monday," he said finally, turning to leave. "And you'll be removing your markers from my fence, unless you want a court to do it for you." That should have been the end of it. In a world that valued reason and fairness, maybe it would have been. But that sticker was never about the truck. It was about a message. Someone in that boardroom decided they'd had enough of Clay West and his ranch, his horses, his trucks, and his stubborn refusal to blend in with the plastic neighborhood aesthetic they were trying to enforce like it was divine law. The sticker was a warning shot. A test. What they didn't realize was that Clay didn't bluff, and he sure as hell didn't fold. That evening, as he parked the Silverado beneath the barn's overhang, Clay noticed something that made his jaw tighten. 3 golf carts, the type used by board members and community patrols, were parked just inside the tree line bordering his west pasture. They weren't on his land, technically, but they were watching, like cowards waiting for the right moment to escalate again. Clay stepped out of his truck, boots crunching on gravel. He looked at those carts for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he turned toward the barn, the corners of his mouth shifting. Not into a smile, but something far sharper. They'd taken their shot. Now it was his turn. Clay didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't from rage or anxiety. Those were emotions for men still trying to prove something. No, Clay's restlessness came from calculation. The kind of quiet, measured thinking that ran deep in men who had spent their lives solving their own problems. He sat on the porch for a long time, watching the tree line where those golf carts had been. They were gone now, slipped away sometime before dusk, like shadows with a curfew. But the impression remained. He knew a message when he saw one, and the silence behind it was louder than any confrontation. They were testing him again, this time without stickers or tow threats. This was surveillance, quiet intimidation. They'd abandoned pretense and were now operating under the assumption that he'd simply give up and move along, that a man like him, one who preferred privacy and peace, would buckle under the weight of slow, suffocating pressure. But the thing about pressure was, It either cracked stone or forged it. The next morning, Clay began his day like any other. Fed the horses, checked the perimeter, cleaned the troughs, and made a call to his lawyer. Alicia Monroe answered before the first ring finished. "I figured I'd hear from you sooner," she said dryly. "You knew they'd escalate?" "They always do when they're ignored," Alicia replied. "That kind of power only feels real if it's noticed." "What happened?" Clay told her about the sticker, the attempted tow, the fence markers, and the golf carts lurking in the trees. Alicia listened without interrupting, but Clay could hear her scribbling notes. "Send me everything," she said when he finished. "Photos, documents, time-stamped videos, if you've got them. I'll draft a cease and desist and a formal boundary reaffirmation." "What about the surveyor flag?" he asked. "I'll have the county clerk verify any recent submissions," she replied. "If they're redrawing boundaries without legal basis, we'll catch it." After the call, Clay walked the property again, this time with a fresh set of eyes. He found a second marker, low in the grass near the rear gate, partially obscured by an overgrowth of rye. Someone had walked the line, tried to lay quiet claim to land that wasn't theirs. It wasn't amateur work either. These weren't kids or pranksters. It was deliberate, methodical, and likely done at night or early morning when no one would see. Clay documented it all, even the boot prints leading back toward the sidewalk on the community edge. They were narrow, shallow, nothing that screamed identity, but the pattern was distinct. A square heel with a chipped right tread. He noted it without satisfaction. He wasn't playing detective. He just refused to be blindsided. It was later that afternoon, while Clay was repairing a section of fence near the north line, that a white SUV rolled slowly past his drive, then stopped and reversed a few feet. Clay didn't look up at first. There was always traffic from the nearby equestrian trail, but when he heard the window rolled down and his name spoken like a reprimand, he knew who it was before he turned. "Mr. West," came the voice, too crisp, too smug to be anyone but Karen Stratton. Clay straightened, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, and turned toward the road. "Karen," he said, his tone neutral. She leaned over the passenger seat, chin high, sunglasses perched like armor. "I saw your vehicle was still parked near the fence," she said. "After that sticker was issued, I assumed you'd take action." "I did," Clay replied calmly. "I removed the sticker, contacted legal counsel, and confirmed your committee has no jurisdiction on my land." Karen's lips twitched. "Well, we've consulted our legal advisory board as well," she said, brushing invisible lint from her lapel. "And we've determined that your access point falls within shared communal infrastructure. That gives us limited, but enforceable, oversight." Clay said nothing. He just stared at her, eyes steady. "We're not trying to be difficult," Karen continued, mistaking his silence for submission. "But you have to understand, appearances matter. When someone drives through our neighborhood and sees farm equipment, industrial trucks, it disrupts the harmony we've cultivated." Clay stepped forward, slowly, until he stood just inside the boundary line. Not on the road, not close enough to be accused of intimidation, but near enough that she felt the shift in presence. "This isn't your land, Karen," he said softly. "You don't cultivate anything here. This ground's been worked by my family for 3 generations. Your harmony is built on paper rules and pretty fences. Mine's built on actual labor, actual use, and actual ownership. So, if you think for 1 second that I'll roll over because you printed a sticker and called it policy, think again." Karen blinked, then recoiled just slightly as if realizing the depth of her miscalculation. She reached for her window control. "I'll be escalating this," she said, voice thinner now. Clay tilted his head slightly. "Then make sure your escalation's built on law. Because if it's not, you're going to find out how fast your authority crumbles when it meets someone who actually knows what boundaries mean." The window slid up. The SUV pulled away. Clay returned to his work without another word. That night he received an email from Alicia. Attached was a scanned copy of a document recently filed with the local zoning board, an amendment to the access map of Cedar Heights. It outlined a proposed adjustment to the shared use boundary, listing unutilized transitional space as justification. The signature. A name Clay hadn't seen before. Logan Marwick, Regional Compliance Officer. The document was preliminary, not yet approved, but it was clear what was happening. They were attempting to redefine his access road as communal property under the guise of a technical correction, which would give them legal grounds for enforcement. It was clever, slippery, but ultimately flawed, because Clay had something they didn't: history, usage, and clear lines drawn in public record. The next day, a stranger showed up at his gate. Not a neighbor, not a surveyor, someone new, dressed in khakis and a navy polo embroidered with community services. The man introduced himself as Todd, just Todd, and claimed to be performing an environmental compliance check. Said something about checking runoff potential from Clay's driveway into the adjoining bioswale. Clay didn't budge. "You got ID?" Todd hesitated, then produced a laminated badge with his name, a company that didn't match the uniform, and no county seal. "Got a permit?" I was told I didn't need one for preliminary checks." "Then come back with someone who knows what they're doing," Clay said, and shut the gate in his face. Later that evening, he found another surveyor flag. This one was placed near the barn, on the opposite side of the property, far from any contested road. A provocation, pure and simple. They were trying to rattle him, get him to react, slip up, or create a paper trail they could manipulate. But Clay didn't rattle. He documented, archived, and sent it all to Alicia. Then he took the weekend and did something they wouldn't expect. Nothing. No angry letters, no retaliatory gestures. He simply kept working, kept operating his ranch, and let the weight of their overreach accumulate. By Monday morning, the community board had sent him a formal notice, printed, sealed, and delivered by courier. It read like a summons, filled with passive-aggressive legalese and veiled threats about code violations, pending hearings, and community interest clauses. It was all fluff, meant to look intimidating, meant to scare someone less grounded, less prepared. Clay read it once, chuckled low in his throat, and handed it to Alicia during their Monday meeting. "They're digging themselves into a hole," she said. "Keep everything documented and do not engage unless I approve it." "I won't," Clay replied, "but I will be making a statement soon." She raised an eyebrow. "Do I want to ask?" Clay leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Let's just say, if they want to enforce aesthetics, I'll show them what branding really looks like." Clay didn't rush his response. He understood something the board didn't, that timing mattered more than noise. They were used to people reacting with outrage, storming into their offices or flooding their inboxes with angry rants that could be dismissed as emotional instability or non-compliance. That tactic didn't work on a man who had shoveled manure in silence for 30 years, who knew how to be patient even while the wolves circled. While they filed papers and dropped flags like breadcrumbs across his land, Clay spent 3 days quietly preparing his answer. Not a rebuttal, not a counterclaim, but a message. And he intended it to be as visual, unmistakable, and permanent, within legal bounds, as the violation sticker they had slapped onto his truck. First, he made a few calls. One to a friend from his high school days who now ran a vinyl graphics company in the next county over. Then another to a local mechanic with a reputation for discretion and craftsmanship. A man who did custom wraps for commercial fleets without asking too many questions. Clay sent photos, measurements, and precise instructions. By Monday morning, the design was complete and waiting in a file. A minimalist black and white logo of a longhorn skull wrapped in rope beneath the clean, bold words, "Harper Ranch, built, not bought." The second part was more symbolic than necessary. But Clay wanted the message to be sharp, directed, and just provocative enough to sting without being crude. The final piece was scheduling the install. He told the vinyl tech to be at the south end of the trailhead, well away from neighborhood cameras, and to expect 6 identical golf carts for decal placement. Clay spent the next evening on foot, walking the tree line between his land and the neighborhood greenbelt. The carts, always parked just beyond the public trail access, were typically left unsecured, no doubt a symbol of the trust the board thought they'd cultivated. They were used for casual patrols, wellness checks, and impromptu transport of community board members during events. Clay waited until twilight, when most of the neighborhood traffic had quieted and the last dog walkers had returned home. He used a small utility trailer hitched to an old ATV, loaded each cart carefully one by one, and covered them with a tarp. There was no trespassing involved. The carts were parked in a no-man's land of shared access, an area still under review by the county, technically unclaimed and unenforced. Clay had confirmed that detail with Alicia the day before. If anyone questioned it later, he could simply state he was relocating abandoned property for temporary safekeeping. A stretch, but not an outright fabrication. By morning, the carts had been returned to their original position, cleaner than before, their frames spotless, tires checked, batteries fully charged, and of course each one bore the new branding. Not spray-painted or scratched in out of spite, but professionally wrapped in high-quality vinyl. Elegant, slick, and undeniably intentional. Harper Ranch, built, not bought, stretched across the driver's side doors, while the hood of each cart displayed the Longhorn Skull logo like a family crest. Clay had even made sure the wrap colors matched the neighborhood's color code, just for added irony. He didn't say a word about it. He just waited. The explosion came quickly. Within 3 hours of sunrise, he heard the first voicemail ping on his phone, then the second, then a cascade. Messages from concerned board members. One from Karen herself, whose voice dripped with a venomous civility as she demanded an explanation for the defacement of community property. Clay didn't respond. He turned the volume off and went to work as usual, feeding the horses, cleaning out the tack room, and clearing debris from the north paddock. By noon, a white SUV with community livery rolled up to his gate and stopped just short of the property line. 2 men stepped out, neither of whom he recognized. Both wore matching polo shirts and clipboards tucked under their arms like weapons. Clay met them halfway up the drive. "We'd like to speak with you about the golf carts," the taller one said, his tone clipped but not yet confrontational. Clay nodded. "They look good, don't they?" "That's not funny, sir," the shorter one said. "This is vandalism." "It's a wrap," Clay replied flatly. "Removable, non-permanent, no structural damage. You're welcome." The taller man stepped forward. "Did you authorize this modification?" "I executed it," Clay said. "On unregulated communal ground. If you've got a legal claim to the carts, I'm sure the sheriff can sort that out. Otherwise, I'd recommend reviewing your property rights before tossing words like vandalism around." The 2 men exchanged a glance. "This isn't over," one of them muttered. "Didn't say it was," Clay replied and walked back to the barn. By midweek, the situation had entered a new phase. The community board called an emergency meeting, one that was streamed privately to residents with a digital key code. Clay didn't bother watching. He had better things to do, but Alicia forwarded him the minutes afterward. The discussion was filled with outrage, vague references to property disrespect, visual sabotage, and intentional destabilization. Karen had apparently taken the lead, calling for decisive action against individuals undermining the community's identity. The board couldn't legally fine Clay, not for something done on neutral ground, but they could retaliate in smaller, pettier ways. And they did. 3 days later, Clay received a notice about excessive noise, citing early morning tractor activity. The irony was so thick it was almost funny. He used that tractor for 10 years, every morning at 6:30 a.m. Never once had there been a complaint. But now it was an acoustic disturbance. The following day, he got a warning for dust migration, claiming that wind from his west paddock was blowing particulate matter into the walking trails. Then came the complaint about unsightly storage, because he left a coiled hose near his barn. One after the other, the complaints rolled in, none enforceable, but all officially filed. Clay documented each one, filed counter-requests for clarification, and forwarded everything to Alicia. She responded with increasing irritation, not at him, but at the coordinated harassment. "They're trying to bury you in paper," she said on a Thursday afternoon call. "It's classic administrative warfare. You either get exhausted or slip up, and then they pounce." "Let 'em pounce," Clay said. "They don't know what exhaustion looks like." But even for a man like Clay, the effort took a toll. His mornings were consumed with bureaucracy, his afternoons with tending the animals, and his evenings with paperwork. He didn't sleep as well. He found himself locking his gates more often, double-checking the cameras along the fence line, and noticing footprints where none should have been. The tension was building like storm pressure in the air, silent, heavy, inescapable. Then came the move that confirmed everything. Clay returned from a supply run one afternoon to find the entrance to his ranch blocked, not with a notice or warning, but with a temporary construction barrier. Bright orange cones, reflective tape, and a folding sign that read, "Access Restricted, Soil Erosion Study." There was no truck, no crew, no tools, just the message and the obstruction. He checked with the county that evening. No study was scheduled. No permit issued. It was pure fiction. Clay didn't remove the barrier. He photographed it from every angle, uploaded the images to a shared folder with Alicia, and sat down that evening to draft a statement, not for the board, not for the residents, but for himself. A clear outline of the campaign being waged against him, the timelines, the lies, the overreach. He wasn't going to take it to the news or splash it online. That wasn't his style. But if this ever ended up in front of a judge, he wanted a record so detailed it couldn't be ignored. The next morning, he moved the barrier 2 feet to the right, still visible, still undisturbed, but no longer blocking access to his land. He left a note taped to it. "Please don't litter. My cattle chew everything." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. The real message had already been sent, and soon it would become unavoidable. By the end of the week, Clay was no longer waiting for the next move. He was planning the counterweight. The slow accumulation of nonsense, paper violations, fictional barriers, bogus flags, and shadows in the trees, had moved beyond passive harassment and become a deliberate obstruction. He didn't need Alicia to tell him that much. What he did need was something she had suggested a week prior and which, until now, he had dismissed as too early, too aggressive. Now it didn't feel aggressive, it felt appropriate. It was time to bring in someone who wasn't emotionally involved, someone outside the fold of county bureaucracy or community politics, who could walk onto his property, look at the layout, the maps, the legal lines, and tell him not what was fair, but what would hold up when push came to shove. So Clay hired a third-party land survey firm, not one from the nearby counties, but a neutral team out of state, flown in to avoid any potential local bias or influence. The head of the firm, a man named Harris, was blunt, precise, and not easily impressed. He walked the full property over the course of 3 days, documented existing borders with GPS tracking, compared public record to Clay's internal archives, and conducted a thorough topographical scan of the access road in dispute. Harris didn't offer opinions, just data. But when he finished his review and handed Clay the full breakdown, his one offhand comment spoke volumes. If this was happening in a city with a real zoning board, he said, they'd be the ones getting fined. The report was ironclad. Clay's driveway, access path, eastern paddock line, and even the disputed patch near the barn fell well within his ownership boundaries as registered in both historical and modern plats. The area claimed by the community board in their adjustment request overlapped only with a sliver of shared utility easement, meant for emergency services and weather runoff, not pedestrian or vehicular access. That detail mattered, because it meant that while the board could claim concern about shared infrastructure, they had no authority to regulate the land for cosmetic purposes or vehicle storage. The sticker on Clay's truck hadn't just been an overreach, it had been a willful misrepresentation of jurisdiction. Clay forwarded the full report to Alicia and then made copies for his own records, sealing them in weatherproof folders and locking them inside his safe. He didn't plan to use the documents yet, but he knew that when the time came, he would be ready. He also had Harris prepare an executive summary, stripped of jargon and formatted like an exhibit, so that if anyone ever tried to throw bureaucracy at him again, he could answer with numbers and lines, not arguments. But that wasn't all Clay did. While the legal structure of his defense was now solid, he knew that perception still shaped reality in communities like Cedar Heights. They weren't trying to beat him in court. They were trying to beat him in optics, by turning him into an outlier, a nuisance, a symbol of non-compliance. They weren't afraid of Clay's violations, they were afraid of his independence. So, Clay stopped hiding that independence. Instead of retreating into quiet, he leaned into visibility. He began hosting twice-weekly community horse sessions. Not formal therapy like he used to run, but informal demonstrations, horsemanship basics, ranch maintenance tours, land stewardship Q&As. He invited local families, school volunteers, young couples who'd recently moved in and felt out of place among the hyper-organized social structure of the board. Clay made it clear that anyone was welcome, provided they respected the land and didn't bring politics through the gate. People came. Not in droves, but in a steady stream. Some were just curious. Others were tired of HOA meetings and wanted to see the other side for themselves. A few came quietly, parking blocks away so they wouldn't be seen. Clay didn't comment on that. He let them watch, ask questions, pet the horses, drink iced tea, and leave with smiles. He wasn't campaigning. He was anchoring, establishing that what he did on his land mattered, that it brought value, and that the story being painted of him by people like Karen Stratton was just that, a story. Of course, Karen wasn't sitting idle. The more popular Clay's weekend gatherings became, the more desperate the board grew to retake the narrative. But they couldn't accuse him of violating land use, not after Harris's report. They couldn't challenge the community events. Clay had already filed the proper forms to classify his land as an educational space under the state's agricultural extension program. So they did the only thing left. They escalated the pressure in ways that were harder to trace, harder to defend against. First, the power at his front gate started shorting. At first, Clay thought it was just the summer heat. But after the third outage in 2 weeks, he checked the panel and found the box tampered with. Wires exposed and a grounding rod misaligned. Not cut, not destroyed, but manipulated in a way that only a professional or someone with detailed knowledge of power boxes would know to do. He fixed it, documented the damage, and installed a backup battery with wireless alerts. Then came the water issue. Clay noticed low pressure in his main barn tap, which drew from a shared utility line running along the neighborhood's edge. A day later, he found a service tag stuck to his pump valve indicating unauthorized use. There had been no inspection, no ticket, no call. The county water authority, when contacted, confirmed they had sent no one. Clay checked the security camera near the gate, blurred for 2 full minutes during the supposed window of entry. Whoever had come knew where the blind spot was. Clay didn't react. He just rerouted the barn water to a secondary well and filed a police report, not because he expected action, but because he wanted a formal record. The final push came in the form of a letter, not an official notice, but a thin, white envelope left in his mailbox without postage. Inside was a folded sheet of standard printer paper with a typed message. There's a limit to how far you can push. Some fences aren't meant to be crossed. No name, no threats, just a vague warning and a fingerprint smudge in the upper corner. Clay read the message once, twice, then slid it into a plastic sleeve and dropped it into the same folder as the rest of his documentation. He didn't show anger. He didn't even show concern. Instead, he adjusted his security system, doubled the camera coverage, replaced 2 motion detectors, and installed a pair of wireless trail cams along the tree line. He even added low-voltage lighting around the barn perimeter, not enough to draw attention, but enough to show that he saw what was happening and would not be caught off guard. That night, Clay stood outside his barn under the soft glow of the lights, staring out across the dark pasture. He could feel the tension in the air, not like fear, but like something waiting to break. The lines had been drawn. The masks had dropped. They weren't playing with notices and procedural posturing anymore. This was a siege, not with fire or bullets, but with paperwork, sabotage, and shadow games. But they'd made one miscalculation. They thought Clay was isolated, that because he didn't argue, because he kept to himself, because he didn't shout into the wind, he could be slowly bled out by pressure. They were wrong. He wasn't alone. He had allies. And now, he had momentum. This wasn't the end of their campaign. This was the midpoint. The quiet before he pushed back, permanently. It began not with noise, but with quiet, which made it all the more jarring. After weeks of constant tension, sudden messages, veiled warnings, and petty sabotage, the silence of the following week felt unnatural, too still. There were no new notices, no fresh complaints, no golf carts patrolling the edge of his land, and no new flags staked into the grass. For 2 full days, Clay heard nothing from the board, saw no unfamiliar cars idling at the trail junction, and received no calls from Alicia. At first, he allowed himself the thought that perhaps the weight of the third-party survey report, combined with his community engagement and formal police complaint, had finally slowed them down, that the effort to grind him down with paperwork and underhanded maneuvers had become too costly or too visible. But Clay had spent most of his adult life around livestock, and if there was one thing he understood, it was the difference between rest and tension. Animals went still right before they spooked. Land went silent before a storm, and the quiet he felt now wasn't peace. It was that held breath before something cracked. He was proven right on the 3rd morning, when he drove into town to drop off feed invoices and noticed, halfway down the main road, that a large construction sign had gone up near the turnoff into Cedar Heights. Orange plastic netting ran the length of the trailhead, staked tight into the ground, with printed signs at 20-foot intervals reading, "Access subject to revision. Land use reclassification in progress." It was vague, but deliberate. And while the signs didn't bear a county logo, the font and formatting were similar enough to be mistaken for official. Clay pulled over, stepped out, and examined one closely. There was no seal, no contact number, no issuing authority. Just the statement and a laminated header that read, "Authorized under Local Infrastructure Compliance Initiative." He took photos of each sign, front and back, and followed the netting line, until it curved sharply toward the eastern end of his ranch, running parallel to the back pasture but stopping just short of the irrigation easement. It was a gesture, not an action. No equipment had broken ground, no permits were posted, and no machinery was in sight. But the implication was there. The land was being watched, reviewed, prepared. Clay sent the images to Alicia immediately. Her response came quickly and with the sort of controlled urgency he had come to expect from her. "This is coordinated," she said during their call. "I've already submitted a public record request for any infrastructure reclassification filings. So far, nothing. That signage is fraudulent. They're building a facade of authority, Not through law, but through suggestion. That's how they operate. Appear legitimate until someone makes them prove it. Clay didn't need to be told twice. That afternoon, he filed a formal complaint with the county zoning committee and attached the photo evidence. He also requested an injunction barring any physical alteration of his access points pending legal verification of jurisdiction. It wasn't aggressive. It was procedural, clean, and grounded. It didn't challenge their authority directly. It challenged their foundation, forced them to respond under scrutiny, to answer questions in public record. But just because Clay played within the law didn't mean his enemies would. That night, one of his trail cams triggered an alert. At 1:42 a.m., the motion detector nearest the west gate picked up a movement. Clay reviewed the footage at dawn. It was grainy, black and white, but clear enough to show two figures crouching along the outer edge of the fence line. They weren't teenagers. They moved deliberately, slowly, one holding what appeared to be a measuring wheel, the other snapping photos with a flash-disabled camera. Clay didn't move to confront them. He didn't even leave the house. He logged the timestamp, exported the footage, and sent it to Alicia with a short message. "They're trying to remap in the dark." Her response was brief. "They're panicking." The next step in their escalation was less subtle. Clay received a letter, this time certified and with a return address linked to a law firm in the city, claiming to represent a coalition of concerned residents. The contents of the letter were absurd but threatening. Accusations of environmental hazard due to uncontained animal waste, claims that Clay's fencing impeded native wildlife corridors, and suggestions that the slope of his east pasture could lead to potential runoff violations during rain events. Each claim was loosely rooted, in real language drawn from municipal code and zoning regulations, but misapplied and unsupported. They weren't seeking damages, not yet, but they were demanding a compliance inspection by a third-party agency of their choosing. The implication was clear: cooperate or we escalate. Clay didn't respond immediately. Instead, he had Alicia draft a reply that demanded all evidence of standing, proof of resident coalition legitimacy, and legal basis for third-party enforcement on private land, not under association governance. The reply wasn't just strong, it was surgical. It turned the demand back on itself, requiring a level of transparency and documentation that Clay suspected they couldn't produce without exposing the effort as a paper-thin attempt at intimidation. But even that wasn't the end. Clay came home late one evening to find a "For Sale" sign planted at the edge of his southern pasture, positioned just outside the line of his surveillance cameras. It was new, pristine, bearing the name of a realty group known to work closely with the Cedar Heights Development Office. The sign listed no lot number and no square footage, just the word "opportunity" and a phone number. It was another layer to the illusion, another brick in the false narrative being constructed around him, that his land was already being carved up, portioned off, absorbed. Clay removed the sign, placed it neatly beside his gate, and sent a brief text to the number printed on the placard. It read, "Wrong parcel. Try again." The response never came. At this point, even the people in town had started to notice. At the feed store, the coffee shop, the co-op where he bought seed, people asked quiet questions. "They really pushing on you that hard?" Or, "Heard something about your fence line?" Clay never elaborated. He didn't play the victim. But the concern in their voices said enough. Some of them had seen it before. Not this exact shape, not this precise pressure, but the way systems could turn insular, how people in positions of soft power could convince themselves that pushing out the outlier was a civic duty. That week, Clay made a decision, not to fight harder, but to widen the lens. He reached out to the Agricultural Preservation Council, a nonprofit that worked to protect small-scale ranches and farms from urban overreach. He didn't ask for legal help. He had Alicia. He asked for a land use review and historical preservation assessment. They sent a field agent named Griggs, who walked the property, interviewed Clay, reviewed the legacy documents Clay's father had kept, old maps, livestock records, even hand-drawn outlines of the original fencing layout. Griggs was thorough, nonpartisan, and methodical. His findings were straightforward. Clay's land qualified as a transitional historical zone due to its uninterrupted agricultural use predating suburban annexation. That didn't grant immunity, but it did grant leverage. Any development, reclassification, or shared infrastructure proposal affecting his parcel would now be subject to a higher level of review. It would slow things down, force transparency, apply pressure in the other direction. Clay wasn't trying to win in court. He was trying to shift the weight, to make every inch they tried to claim cost them something. Time, reputation, exposure. He wasn't broadcasting it. He wasn't even talking about it publicly. But the signs were there. People were beginning to see the pattern. That weekend, Clay hosted another gathering, this time under the simple title, Open Barn. No agenda, no formal structure. Just an open gate, a pot of chili on the fire, and horses saddled and ready. Neighbors came, not the bored crowd, but the ones on the fringe. The new couples, the renters, the single fathers, the retirees who didn't go to meetings. They brought questions, stories, and quiet thanks. Some offered help. Some just wanted to say they saw what was happening and didn't like it. Clay never asked for allies, but he didn't turn them away. By Sunday night, the silence was gone. The fight had changed shape. The board wasn't just pressing him anymore. They were watching who stood near him. The shift didn't happen with a dramatic reveal or breaking point. It began quietly in the form of a mistake, one made not by Clay but by those so confident in their campaign against him that they assumed no one was watching as closely as he had been. It started with a document Alicia forwarded him late one night, a supplemental filing sent to the zoning committee by a private firm hired by the board. The document was intended to justify reclassification of the eastern boundary surrounding Clay's pasture, citing public access concerns and community integration realignment. But what the document also contained, buried in the metadata of its digital version, was a revision history. The file had been edited 6 times, and one of the earlier versions still listed Clay's property by name with the phrase non-compliant tract, target for acquisition. It wasn't legal language. It wasn't neutral. It was strategy, exposed. Alicia didn't need to explain what it meant. The board hadn't just been trying to enforce compliance. They had been planning to absorb his land under a manufactured narrative of community necessity. The stickers, the false signs, the sabotage, all of it had been preparation for a much larger move, one that involved redrawing maps and consolidating power under a development clause that allowed for adaptive zoning. But the inclusion of that one, phrase left behind by an incautious editor, shattered their illusion of neutrality. They weren't protecting standards. They were executing a hostile takeover by attrition. And now Clay had proof. But it wasn't just about evidence. Clay understood that documentation alone wouldn't stop them. Bureaucracies were built to absorb damage slowly, to stall, to outlast. So he changed tactics, not by becoming louder, but by becoming unignorable. The next day, he filed a motion through Alicia requesting a formal hearing before the County Land Use Commission. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was something more potent, a public challenge to the board's entire campaign, based on the verifiable overreach, procedural manipulation, and now intent. The request triggered a mandatory discovery period, which meant the board would now have to submit all communications, filings, and planning materials used in their campaign against Clay for review. And it meant they would no longer be operating in the shadows. Clay didn't stop there. He contacted the regional agricultural advocate, a semi-governmental liaison responsible for monitoring suburban encroachment into designated agricultural zones. He presented the case as a test, an attempt to rewrite the definition of compliance in a way that could displace any working landholder unwilling to conform to suburban optics. The advocate listened, requested documents, and began a quiet inquiry. Clay knew it wouldn't yield action overnight, but it didn't have to. What it did was add another layer of scrutiny, one the board couldn't ignore. Then came the public notice. Within a week of the discovery request, the County Commission published an agenda item titled Boundary Challenge Hearing, Private Parcel, a Community Reclassification Plan. The title was neutral. The implications were not. The board's private maneuver was now subject to public commentary and administrative oversight, and once the notice went live, people started asking questions. Other residents, other landowners, even members of nearby neighborhoods. Because once the details were known, once it became clear that the campaign against Clay could easily become a precedent applied elsewhere, the board's internal momentum fractured. Clay didn't gloat. He prepared. In the days leading up to the hearing, he compiled a binder of physical documentation. Every photo, every notice, every recording, and every time-stamped file showing false authority, improper signage, deliberate obstruction, and now, evidence of intent to seize. Alicia helped him structure it chronologically, and Griggs, the preservation field agent, submitted a separate analysis on Clay's land use history, emphasizing its continuity and legal protection under state guidelines. By the time they arrived at the hearing, their position wasn't just defensive, it was dominant. The hearing itself was held in a modest county building, functional and gray, with folding chairs lined before a raised dais and a small recording camera set in the corner. Clay wasn't a man built for courtroom spectacle. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't posture. He sat quietly beside Alicia while the board's representative, a hired attorney with the bland confidence of a man used to pushing unchallenged documents through government channels, began his statement. He spoke in platitudes: community interest, uniform appearance, shared development goals. But when Alicia took her turn, she didn't respond in kind. She opened Clay's binder, laid it flat on the desk, and walked the commission through every step of the campaign. Each sticker, each false report, each illegal sign, and, finally, the edited planning document with the phrase, "Target for Acquisition." The room changed after that. The board's attorney asked for recess. It was denied. A commissioner asked whether the board had ever attempted direct negotiation with Clay. The attorney admitted they had not. A second commissioner asked if the board had legal authority to regulate a private parcel zoned agricultural with its own easement protections. The answer, after a long pause, was no. A third commissioner turned to Clay and asked if he had ever considered selling his land. Clay looked the man dead in the eye and said, "This land raised my father. It taught discipline to kids with no structure. It heals veterans with more scars than peace. So, no, Commissioner, I haven't considered selling. And with all due respect, I never will." The hearing ended not with a gavel, but with a motion, an order to suspend all further attempts at reclassification of Clay's property pending a full legal review. The board was instructed to cease all contact and enforcement efforts until further notice. It wasn't total victory, but it was a public acknowledgement. Clay had been targeted, unjustly, and officially the campaign against him was now under formal scrutiny. Afterward, as he stood outside in the late afternoon sun, Alicia beside him reviewing notes, residents began to exit the building. Some passed without speaking. A few offered nods. And then Karen Stratton emerged, flanked by two board members, her face stony. She stopped a few feet from Clay just outside earshot, as if waiting for a parting blow. Clay didn't give her one. He just turned, got into his truck, and drove home. Because he knew something she didn't. It was already over. The silence after the hearing was different. It wasn't the weaponized quiet of anticipation or the deceptive calm before another move. It was real. The notices stopped. The golf carts vanished from the trail edge. The shadow letters and phony flags no longer reappeared in the morning dew. What had once been a near-daily push against Clay's boundaries became an absence that felt strange at first, then settling, then justified. He hadn't won everything. The county had not declared the board's actions illegal in final terms, nor had they dismantled the reclassification proposal outright, but the injunction stood, and so did the scrutiny. Every step the board had taken was now being reviewed by real investigators, by clerks who didn't answer to them, and by state officials who hadn't appreciated being dragged into a neighborhood's private war over aesthetics and imagined authority. Clay didn't celebrate. There were no toasts, no grand speeches. Instead, he got up the next morning like always, walked the fence line, filled the troughs, and started repairs on the south gate that had needed tending for over a month. The sky that day was clear, wind low, and for the first time in weeks the weight around his shoulders wasn't pushing him downward. It was behind him. He hadn't beaten them with noise or revenge. He had done it the only way a man like him could, with facts, patience, and a refusal to give up what was his, simply because someone in a golf cart thought a truck and a barn didn't match their brochure. Within a month, the county commission issued its findings. The board had exceeded its regulatory authority. The signage had no basis in code, the property lines were unchanged, and the targeted acquisition language in their planning drafts constituted what the commission called preemptive encroachment with presumed compliance. It wasn't criminal, but it was a stain. The reclassification plan was voided, and the firm hired by the board was reprimanded for improper submission protocol. Karen Stratton was removed from her position, quietly but decisively, replaced by a rotating subchair while the board underwent internal procedural realignment. Clay read the report in silence. Then he closed it, placed it in the safe beside the others, and went outside to check the west pasture where one of the mares had foaled the night before. That summer, people came back. The families who had walked his grounds during those open barn evenings began to stop by again, not just for the horses, but for the space, the peace, the way the ranch made them feel normal in a place that had been trying too hard to be perfect. A few of them offered their help. One man, an older veteran who'd kept his distance for years, asked if Clay needed assistance clearing the overgrowth near the East Trail. Another, one of the newer residents, volunteered to fix the weather stripping on the barn doors. Clay accepted quietly without fanfare. He wasn't building an army. He was rebuilding trust, not just in his neighbors, but in the idea that maybe not everyone was watching from the shadows, waiting for him to fail. Some had just been unsure, caught between fear and truth. Now the truth was visible, and that made all the difference. By early fall, Clay filed a petition with the county for an official conservation designation on his land, not to lock it from use, but to ensure that future development efforts would have to clear a higher bar. The petition was supported by community signatures. Some came from those who had once stayed silent. One of them was even from a former board member. Clay didn't ask why, he just signed his name beneath theirs and submitted it. Alicia called a week later to confirm it had passed preliminary approval. She asked if he was considering legal action for the harassment. He said no, not because he forgave them, not because he didn't have a case, but because he'd already taken back what mattered. He had reclaimed his peace without compromising who he was, and that, more than any fine, more than any punishment, was the victory that lasted. On the 1-year mark of the first violation sticker, Clay hosted a barbecue. He didn't call it that. There were no invitations, no posters, no flyers. Just a Saturday with an open gate, a few long tables near the barn, a grill going steady, and iced tea in metal jugs. People came, dozens of them. They brought kids, dogs, side dishes. Someone brought a radio. Someone else strung up lights between the trees without asking. Clay let them. He even smiled once when he saw one of the new